for 2019. So they're out. She's cheering them on. One of her sons is playing in it for the championship. So this is the furthest Turlock's ever gotten. So it's a big deal. So she couldn't make this today. Declaration of conflicts of interest. Looking to my left and hearing and seeing none. And then as well, Commission?
As well, any conflicts of interest? None?
Outstanding. So let's go through. We just did roll call, but just real quickly, how long you've been on or something like that so that we can share a little bit more. We can start with Councilmember Nasrati.
Hey everyone, Councilmember Nasrati, District 3. I got recently elected in this past November.
Nicole Larson, District 1, recently elected in this November as well.
Yellow Scare, District 2, elected a couple years ago.
Bob Lawton, City Manager.
Doug White, City Attorney, not elected.
Jennifer Land, City Clerk.
Stacy Tonerelli, Deputy City Clerk.
Well, thank you, Mayor. I'm Jeff Powers, Planning Commission Chair, and we'll start at my right.
Ray Souza, recently appointed. Matt Davis, appointed about a year.
Constance Anderson, I've been on the commission for 3 years now.
Jim Reed, been on the commission a little over 2 years.
Anakin Verani, about 6 months.
And Elvis Diaz, been on the commission.
Right.
Forever.
Katie Quintero, planning staff.
And Amy, the mayor. So thank you all for participating, everybody for coming to this. We're going to get started here with approval agenda as posted or amended for council first. We have a motion
I'll second that.
and a second. Clerk.
Councilmember Nasrati,
Yes?
Councilmember Larson,
Yes.
Councilmember Escare,
Yes.
Mayor Bublak.
Yes, passes 4-0.
All right. Approval of the agenda as posted or amended. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Great. Okay.
You can't do that all.
Is that what
Public participation, this is limited to items described in the notice as a 3-minute time thing. So anyone who wishes to speak, come up to the dais, to the lectern. Okay, if not, we will close that public hearing. And Planning Commission action item. Who's going to do this? Just, oh, all right, because you brought somebody with you. I thought you were just,
I didn't. I'll introduce her. So from my office is Leah Burnley, who's joining me. She'll be assisting us with the Planning Commission. Y'all will get to know her. She recently worked at Tesla before she came over a couple months ago.
zoom.
So don't hold that against her. Let me get the PowerPoint up. There's the little thing in the chat. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak tonight, both council and commission. This isn't an agendized item for action tonight, unlike the other night where we talked about it from the perspective of just information gathering and introduction of the idea. The action item that's being presented to the Planning Commission item and for comment by the City Council would be the zoning code for the commercial cannabis business activities, which follows the City of Turlock's pilot program that was recently adopted by the council earlier this year. With that, the city attorney, we're a contract, and so that's the name of the firm that we represent. We're going to kind of just go over this right now and provide some background. So let me start by saying how we got to this place. We talked about the pilot program, but going a little bit further back than this, you have Proposition 215, which was passed a long time ago, the Compassionate Use Act. Somebody would remind me probably the date, but I think it was even before 2000. So it's been on the books for quite a 96. Thank you. So it's been quite a while, and that kind of introduced California to the medical marijuana industry in a legalized, decriminalized way. Most recently, Prop 64 passed, which decriminalized recreational use of marijuana and allowed for, within the state, so interstate commerce, the sale of commercial cannabis for recreational purposes. As you'll hear from probably many of the folks who have responded to the RFQ, many people who use it for medical purposes now come in under the auspices of recreational because of the fact that they don't have to go through the hassle of getting a doctor's recommendation. But irrespective of those distinctions, recreational cannabis is decriminalized within the state of California as long as you follow certain rules, and commercial cannabis sales are allowed within the state with no interstate commerce. The follow from that has been several years of both the state and local jurisdictions adopting these types of ordinances, whether it be the pilot program, which set the sensitive uses and kind of allow commercial cannabis businesses to operate within Turlock, or by contrast, it's the zoning, which is where these businesses can be located by use, whether it's cultivation, manufacturing, dispensaries, which is the retail consumer-facing side, testing, any of the uses that we are going to go over today. Turlock, from a perspective of addressing this issue, is a little bit behind in this area. In Stanislaus County alone, both the county, Modesto, Patterson, Riverbank, Oakdale, and Ceres have already taken action and adopted, and many of these things have been on the books for over a year. And if you look at neighboring areas, Atwater and Merced have already adopted things as well, and I could continue to go, on and on. So the idea that the zoning that's being introduced today, the concepts that are being introduced aren't new and have been in the area for a while. And in fact, even as close as Denair, we have a legally operating dispensary within the county serving the Turlock population. Much. This also comes on the heels of the Bureau of Cannabis Control's recent regulations that specified that folks could deliver, if you have a permit, a retail permit that allows for delivery, that those permits allowed you to go into jurisdictions, even those jurisdictions like Newman, which we represent, that don't allow it. In other words, you could not then prevent somebody from delivering recreational or medical cannabis into a community that prohibits it completely or that limits it to just the regulated users. Now, our law firm has taken the lead with the support of the League of California Cities and over 30 jurisdictions, which include the city of Turlock, in addressing that and filing a lawsuit against the Bureau of Cannabis Control, declaring that that was an unconstitutional regulation that was passed, and that Prop 64 promised each jurisdiction the right to regulate who was going to be offered commercial cannabis, if at all, within their local jurisdictions. That case is being tried in Fresno, and it is our belief that we will prevail. But we are in a time between when we anticipate winning that lawsuit and while the Bureau of Cannabis Control's regulation is in place, which creates some uncertainty during that time. So that means that currently, as we speak, commercial cannabis, both recreational and medical, is being delivered from folks outside the area in an unregulated, uncontrolled, untaxed environment where the community of Turlock does not receive any form of public benefit and often doesn't even receive any of the sales tax because it's not reported. And that's not even getting into the very prevalent black market that exists in Stanislaus County, which is probably the biggest threat to both the legal market as well as that. Because unfortunately, what we've done in California is decriminalized it without making the really great distinctions between the legal market and the black market. So we've created a little bit of a quandary that we're probably going to wind up having to fix to make sure that those folks who are operating have the tools that they need to be recognized as legal. Recognized as legal during that time. So with that, when we were at the Planning Commission Council, there was 3 things that they directed me to do. I love making. Number 1, we wanted better maps so that we could look at them and we could kind of see and go down to the, I think there was Commissioner Diaz that requested that, although I think it was on a lot of their minds. Better maps, which I have, although they're not in the presentation, so I may have to exit PowerPoint to go, but we can zoom and explore to whatever your heart desire is, or at least the capabilities of the computer. The second thing is we wanted to have a conversation, and I think this comes from Commissioner Souza, better definitions or at least explanation of some of the definitions, in particular as it relates to youth centers and daycare. So I have that, and we're going to talk about that. And then I think, third is I want to just address the speed with which, kind of we're going. If you use my conservative estimate of what the city stands to gain from having a regulated commercial cannabis environment, each month equals about $166,000 on my conservative estimate of what it means to the city. Not just because you're going to get money from it doesn't mean that you should go fast. That being said, we have the distinction of I've worked on, this is my 9th city that I've adopted zoning and commercial cannabis ordinances for. Not all of them were to allow as permissible as use as this. So, for instance, Newman doesn't allow it at all. Angels Camp decided that you could do it, but you had to be from outside the area, and you just had to come and register with the city and with the police chief so that we knew you were legal. And Sonora decided to only allow medical. And there are other kind of abbreviations of that. When I used to be in Atwater, actually I've done it 10 times, I forgot, because I resigned from Atwater. Atwater, they had an unlimited amount, and other places like Dixon have a limited amount. And the limits are usually, that I gave to the council, are typically based off of population, 1 per every 20 to 25,000 in population. Is there any science to that, or no? There really isn't. But I do think that having had worked with folks who have been open for in excess of a year, almost 2, that those numbers have penciled out to be kind of very workable numbers without creating excess saturation or and minimizing any kind of adverse impacts that you might have from the community from having, the feeling that there is a cannabis dispensary on every corner. I want to make the distinction that when we talk about, most of what we're going to talk about is going to be the cannabis dispensaries, and let me preface that as to why. Cannabis dispensaries, we talk about that so much because it's the sole consumer-facing interface. It's the sole interaction that members of the public will have. If somebody's running a good testing facility, cultivation facility, manufacturing facility, those relationships should be business to business, and their neighbors should not even know that they exist. Because through the conditional use permit process, we will put in place protections that make sure that there's not odor, that there's security, that we deal with waste management. So their neighbors should not even know that they exist. And if they know that they exist, then they're likely in violation of their conditional use permit process. This process is multi-step. We have people who have responded to an RFQ that we put out. That's a request for qualifications. We're going through the interview process on the dispensary side only. So that involves 32 interviews, 30 minutes in length each. It started yesterday and will conclude on Friday. Those interviews are being done by our city manager, Bob Lawton, our municipal services director, Michael Cook, and the assistant to the city manager, Maren Pitt. And so their decision will form the recommendation that will become before this body in terms of those who will be retail facing. Those who are not dispensary or retails will move to the next level. And aside from whatever background check that the police department does and disqualifications that may come from that, or from the negotiations with the city attorney where they don't get presented to you because we deem them to not have a good fit, you all will be the first major interface and filter to make sure that the people who are operating in the city of Turlock are representative and would be good community members and the type of businesses that we would want to operate, both in terms of good neighbors and cultural fits. So with that, let me get back into the meat. This is going to be a little bit redundant for some of you, but I think given the importance of the issue, a lot of this bears repeating. And again, I'll try to emphasize the issue that the commission asked me to address. Council, I want you to fill, this is, we set aside 2 hours on purpose, not just for the attorney to talk a whole lot, although I'm an attorney, so we're prone to do that. But for you guys to ask lots and lots of questions, because it is my hope that whatever product comes out of tonight's actions would be able to also represent a lot of the council's views and perspectives. So I would encourage the council and the commission to continue to ask questions. You do not need to wait until I finish the presentation to ask those questions. This can be as interactive as you would like it to be. So with that, let's get to some specifics. On June 11th, the City Council adopted the pilot program. It's Ordinance 1255-CS. We are at our meeting later tonight proposing some changes to that. In that, it created a 600-foot setback or sensitive use proximity requirement to certain things, schools, youth centers, daycares, as an example. So I want to start right off the bat by answering some of Commissioner Souza's questions about what do these definitions mean. So we use the definitions that actually come from state code, which also means by citing to them, we actually put the code language in there, but reference the actual code citations so that as those code definitions change over time, not that the state ever changes the rules, but as those change time, that they stay current and up to date. Daycare, as an example, means a facility, center, or home requiring a license that is issued by the state of California, which provides for the care, health, safety, supervision, or guidance of a child's social, emotional, and educational growth on a regular basis in a place other than the child's own home or any facility meeting the definition of Health and Safety Code Section 1596.76. That's a daycare facility. I think that the main distinction has to be, that's in there, is it actually has to be a licensed daycare facility. It can't be just a daycare facility that's operating in an informal way. And we put the onus on the applicant. So the next stage after they get passed and invited to interview is they become an applicant. They fill out an application, a funding agreement where they put down a $25,000 deposit. They go through the police chief's background check, and they get to, we start working with them on this. They'll submit some plans. Those plans will show their location that they are going to be operating in proximity to things like daycare centers. They're responsible for going and looking and figuring out if there's any licensed daycare centers. We, the city, will do our own investigation to make sure that the representations that they've made are in fact accurate. All of the time that the city staff spends verifying this information is paid for by the applicants. This process has zero general fund impact. In other words, we're not taking away from the community's ability to provide law enforcement and firefighters in order to fund a commercial cannabis program. It's all paid for by those who are going to go through the application process. So that's daycare facilities. So hopefully that answers that question. I think more importantly, the youth center, which are youth facilities, which I think was the big crux of it, that means any public or private facility that is primarily used to host recreational or social activities for minors, including but not limited to private youth membership organizations or clubs, social service, teenage club facilities, video arcades, or similar amusement parks. Now, these definitions are matters that are before the council, but I think it's important as part of this joint meeting that it's discussed because I think it's relevant to the commission in terms of what you're going to be asked to evaluate. So even though you don't vote on these definitions, you should feel free to make any comments or concerns that you have with them noted. I will say, as a caveat, so that we don't wind up processing some folks and there's some misunderstandings as to these definitions. These facilities have to be things that are primarily used for youth activities. It can't be just something that's occasionally used for a youth activity. But that being said, that is why we have the conditional use permit process. So it may be that there's a facility that doesn't fall into the category of being primarily used for youth facilities. And I think I'm thinking back to the Commissioner Souza's example that he gave me of maybe some ballparks or something like that are used seasonally, but maybe not all the time. Maybe it's for adult leagues the rest of the time or other purposes that might not fall within this definition. Our conditional use permit process would allow us to put specific restrictions on folks and evaluate those locations, and maybe they're not knocked out because of a youth center proximity requirement, but that doesn't mean that you have to approve them or find them suitable for the area in which they're advocating to be permitted in. So there's multiple layers of protection, making sure that the facilities that folks ask or request to be approved to operate in meet the socio-cultural values of the neighborhood and the community. So hopefully that answers your question, Commissioner. Temporarily. Well, we'll try to get to permanent by the end of this. I also want to make the point, because I think several of my council members have been asked, does anything that I'm talking about today apply or undermine a person's ability to personally cultivate for their own medical or recreational use? And the answer to that is no. All we're talking about now is for-sale, for-profit type operations. We are not talking about what individuals may do on their home. I will say that Turlock has an outdated personal cultivation ordinance that it's no longer compliant with state law, and we expect to be fixing that in the next month or so. But we prioritize certain things like this to be able to kind of catch up with the times. What we will be proposing in the future will be what is required by state law. And you can look to if anyone has questions, you can already look at what's on the book in Patterson, Riverbank, and Oakdale to kind of see what they allow. So what are the existing restrictions? Right now, the sensitive use requirement is that folks will not be allowed to have locations within, and it doesn't matter what type of use, I should say, within 600 feet of a school, daycare center, or youth facility. I will say that on the books right now is included 600 feet from residential zones. I'll show you later why that became problematic. Or 600 feet from homeless shelters that have minor or major administrative applications, right? Approvals. Always forget that, the last one. And that's something that's going to be at our 6 o'clock meeting, which staff is recommending some changes to put in those proximity requirements. They would, and whatever we are asking the commission to do tonight, folks, when they're applying, would be required to process through. So why is this important, and why is the timing important? As I told you earlier, we're going through the process right now this week of interviewing those who responded with RFQ responses to do the retail type of use in Turlock. Council has decided to allow 4. That means that we have to reduce from 32 folks who responded to 4. The good side of that is, I'm gonna have to grab some water. The good thing about that is that, you can do, thank you. Thanks. So the good thing about that is the 32 folks who responded means that we have, and having already sit through the first day of interviews, means that we're going to have 4 excellent folks seeking to do business in the city of Turlock, like extremely high end in terms of capacity, ability, knowledge. So I feel really good about that. Obviously, the negative is that there is going to be 20 some folks who are going to be unhappy with the result, and some of them are going to be excellent folks who operate. But I do think it's important that we walk into this as a pilot program, we test it with 4, and we not go too far pushing the limits. So I feel really good about where we're at right now. Let's talk about the different uses that the council has decided to allow to operate within Turlock. So cultivation is what it is. I mean, it's just the growing of a plant, but it also involves the drying process, the curing process. Cannabis dispensaries or retail sales, that's what we've talked a lot about. So that's a storefront. It would be the equivalent of walking into, I guess I can't use a Blockbuster reference anymore. They're all out of business. That was pretty good, though. I'm dating myself. But obviously the product that's being sold is different. It would be very similar to walking into a liquor store with a lot more security and a lot more precautions, and a lot less ability to just kind of walk down aisles. Distribution, I found this used to be pretty much an accessory use. So somebody's a cultivator, manufacturer, or a retailer, and in order to either pick up and transport their product or package a product, they need that distribution license. It rarely operates on its own, in my experience. It doesn't mean it couldn't. So it would be like, the different companies, like the chip company that, would gather up like Frito-Lay, like Ruffles and I don't know, I don't eat chips anymore. So whatever the chips are that you can eat, and then would take them, the baked Lays, and then would put them on the shelves all at the same time. That wasn't intended. That wasn't intended time. So that was just incidental. So that's pretty good though. So that would be distribution. Manufacturing, it's really volatile and non-volatile, different processes. Manufacturing is the same process that they use to basically extract olive oil out of olives. And that would be the volatile stuff where they use things like butane and other methods to do the extraction method. The non-volatile methods are basically more of a dry ice, freeze it, and then the people in the audience who actually know about this are just going to make fun of me, but hit it against something and then get the cannabinoid product or crystal product to fall to the ground and be collected. So that's the non-volatile type manufacturing. I'm sure it's much more sophisticated than that, but I haven't actually seen it. And then testing laboratories, which we did not, unfortunately, get any RFQs for, although we had 3 people who had approached us at one point in time about being interested in it, and probably the most underserved area of the cannabis market right now. All you're doing is really evaluating something that would be the equivalent of the tip of your pinky in terms of size, and they put it in some fairly sophisticated machines to test for cannabinoid profile, but mostly for molds, pesticides, things of that nature that would be harmful to human consumption. So let's talk specifically about what the action item is for tonight, and that is to Article 7 to Chapter 9.2. So the specific zoning provisions for the Downtown Overlay District and the WISP or TRIP. I guess it's still in our code as a WISP, which is why I have that there. So the permitted uses, what we're going to be proposing as staff is going to be very similar to what has been permitted in every other jurisdiction surrounding us in Stanislaus County and Merced County. So there's nothing overly new and overly creative involved here, which is to have cultivation in the heavy commercial and light commercial, as well as the general industrial. Distribution would be in the same zones. Again, it's kind of an accessory use, mostly to cultivation and manufacturing. And then you would have manufacturing in those same zones. Retail would be allowed, and this is probably the one area I think that there's a lot of policy discussion about. So we, as a staff, went and evaluated where we thought that dispensaries should be. Some communities will decide to put them in the industrial area. Other communities will decide to put them in the commercial area. It was our determination that based off of the impacts in terms of parking, things of that nature, that they were much better suited for community commercial, but we are allowing them to still go into heavy commercial and light industrial. So I think this is the one area where there is some policy debate amongst the different communities about whether or not you're going to allow it in community commercial. And we thought that that was the most similar use, and we have the inventory that would kind of most accommodate, volume, parking, things of that nature. And then testing laboratories would go in commercial, office, community commercial, heavy commercial, and light industrial and general industrial. So this is probably one of the more permissive ones, but again, it's put in places that we think that would be consistent with allowing testing laboratories. And what I should say this, so we have an internal cannabis work group that we formed at the staff level. It involves the city attorney's office, community development office, police, fire, building, parks and rec, municipal services. So pretty much every single department in the city has a representative to provide some level of input. I will say that probably at this junction, it's probably heavily leaning on the city attorney, community development, and police angle, with fire not far behind. The one thing that we are doing, which has, you know what? You want to go do your, you want to, I don't, Katie speaks planner much better than I do, so we'll let her go through this part.
Katie for our lawyer, what?
I know.
So one thing that we are also adding into Article 7 is a distinction between dual zoning and split zoning. And so this is something that we have had for a long time. Dual zoning is when a parcel actually has multiple zoning districts, and that, for example, could be a parcel that was zoned medium density residential and community commercial. In that case, the entire parcel could be developed with either of those uses, or a mixed use could be permitted on that parcel. Split zoning is when we have multiple zoning designations on a parcel, but they are related to a physical area of the parcel. So a good example is we have a parcel along Colorado that's a rather large, long parcel. The portion that fronts onto Colorado is physically zoned commercial office because it's adjacent to other office uses. The back portion is zoned for low-density residential because it fronts onto a residential street. And so within this ordinance, we are defining how we will look at those situations when it comes to cannabis uses. And so what is proposed in the case that there is dual zoning, the more restrictive zoning designation would apply. So if there was a case that, for example, when we had the community commercial and a residential zoning, cannabis businesses would not be permitted because they're not permitted in a residential zoning district. In the case of a split zoned parcel, the area, the zoning that is the majority of the zoning of the parcel will apply. So that is what is proposed for this part of the amendment.
Don't go too far, I think there's another one. We also looked at the downtown overlay. This was an area that was really important in Riverbank, and River made the decision that they did want cannabis businesses in their downtown area as a way to revitalize the area. But in the downtown area, we are prohibiting everything except for retail cannabis sales. But those retail cannabis sales would only be allowed in the downtown core transition and transitional commercial. And so those are kind of indicated on the green stars that are there. So again, when we talk about policy discussions, that was a policy discussion to make sure that it was available in the downtown. So this is a little closer to what Riverbank had allowed than it was to, as an example, I'm trying to think, Oakdale, as an example.
And what's the reason for not having it in downtown?
What would be the reason not? Some of them just were afraid that having a cannabis business would affect the integrity of, some of their historic downtowns. And so there was concerns about a criminal element that might be brought into the downtown when you're trying to revitalize. It might make families feel less welcome. In Riverbank, it's probably had the opposite effect. But I think that those were the concerns that were brought up in terms of why other communities decided to not allow it. I also think it's important to recognize that this is a very new area, emerging, and that there's a specific reason why this is deemed a pilot program. I mean, irrespective of Prop 64, cannabis is still involves an evolving thought process in terms of how it's viewed. And so I think that different communities look at it differently as it relates to their downtown and suitability for those areas.
And so like those two examples you gave, like Oakdale and Riverbank, how long have they had an ordinance?
Both of them about a year.
It's a year.
Yeah, about a year. So, I mean, and in fact, in Riverbank, they're in the process of removing some of the restrictions that they put in place. I think I talked about it at the last workshop. They originally had restrictions that you couldn't operate during the Christmas parade and during the farmers market. They're now looking at kind of removing some of those restrictions because they've had positive has been a positive impact instead of a negative one. Whether or not they actually remove them all, I don't know, but it's the they have a year of experience with that operator, and I think that's the importance of also getting a good operator, right? So you get the wrong operator, it would be bad for the cannabis industry, right? And I think it's an industry that's looking for more mainstream type of acceptance than currently exists, particularly in more conservative communities like Turlock.
And so they've only been a year, so we're not that far behind. Because you kind of made the statement in the beginning, it was kind of like we're late in the game. And so is there other communities that have been doing it longer that we?
Yeah, I mean, Sacramento is an example, Oakland, Santa Cruz, Sonoma. I mean, they've been on the books several years. Most of them basically since Prop 64. I mean, there's other ones that are smaller, kind of more up north. I think that the process in Riverbank, because Riverbank, Oakdale, Patterson, Newman all went right around the same time. Those were probably 6-month processes to getting there. And so in that respect, a lot of the legwork, the workshops, those, they've kind of already been done for the area. I mean, the difference is that the people who are applying now, they already have established records and references that we can call. You're not dealing with like the first batch of people who this is their first time, this foray into the legal regulated cannabis market. So it kind of becomes a deal changer. And I mean, there's only so many ways that you can kind of cut up zoning. And so, I mean, you got industrial, commercial, and residential. I mean, at some level, there's, when there's only so many ways to make a pie, you just kind of, it is what it is. So I think that what we've done is kind of rely on the experiences that we've had, what seems to be the general trends and what's worked well, and make those in terms of recommendations. So I think the value to Turlock is that you're doing it with a lot of experience behind it, as opposed to a situation where it's more of a gut and feel, gosh, I hope this works out well. I hope this is the right place to put it, because this is going to be somewhat difficult to unwind if it's in the wrong spot. At Dixon, we've had, I think, 2 years.
Speaking of the trends, what's happening from what I understand in other cities that have already started, they're looking at lounges being allowed now? Is that something that's been taken into consideration with our zoning and with city council? Is that something that is possibly coming up in the future?
I think, so is it something that's coming up in the future? Yes. Is it something that's coming up in the future in Turlock unless we are required by state law to do it? No. So in other words, the Bureau of Cannabis Control is looking at creating a new permit that would allow lounges, right? And I think that the first legally operating one, I think one is West Hollywood, I have to remember correctly, just opened up 3-4 months ago. And I think that there's going to be a lot more jurisdictions in some of these communities that were kind of like leading it, that are looking at doing those things. I have no desire, interest to present anything to the community of Turlock on that in the near future. So, but again, why I say yes is because just like deliveries where I wasn't given the choice, and just like legislation that was presented this year that basically said that was going to require cities to have dispensaries, whether you wanted them or not, on a basis of your alcohol license, have a ratio with your alcohol license. I don't know what the legislature has in store for me, what little door I get to open and find behind it, and what treasure I get to find behind it. So the Bureau of Cannabis Control, I think is in its infancy. I think they're trying their best, but I don't know that they're overly friendly to local jurisdictions. That's not apparently their mission. We talked about the WISP or the TRIP, and this is the overlay area. There was staff, in order to make sure that we, again, with this being a pilot program, we kind of divided the TRIP into half, with the southern half being an area where it would be allowed, and the northern half where there's been a lot of economic development efforts going in, being an area where it would not. I think that gives us an ability to kind of differentiate these and figure out whether or not having cannabis businesses actually detracts attracts or has any effect on the location of businesses in Turlock. So I think it kind of bifurcates that and gives us the best of both worlds and gives us a real world example to be able to come back to you and see what the impact of it is, if there is anything. So the other thing that this is going to do is obviously we have to update our matrices to be consistent with cannabis and the zoning. So that's part of what's reflected in this zoning amendment. And then we get to the fun part of, having discussion. I would just for a second, because I want to make sure that I address Commissioner Diaz's question. I'm looking for the zoning. So this is it. Oh yeah, this is it. Okay. So I can zoom in, unless you're just like looking at the maps like this, but I wanted to make sure that we could kind of go, ignore that line, sorry. Oh, no, that must not to be there. So give you the ability to kind of look at some of these things. The thing I want to highlight, because it was a discussion as to why later tonight I'm going to be recommending to the council that they eliminate the 600-foot sensitive use requirement to residential. And so, man, I wish I could, oh, there I can do this. Let me give you an example. So this is Golden State right here. If you look at these areas, these are the areas where we were looking at trying to allow like retail dispensaries to operate. And with staff's perspective, that these would be good areas. The problem is when you look at it.
So purple is community commercial.
Purple is,
Okay.
it's on that map.
The light purple is heavy commercial.
Heavy. So the challenge became when you try to get a 600-foot requirement. Turlock has some interesting land use in the way that it curves. So you basically have residential that comes around here and then jogs down and over here and then jogs down and over here and then jogs down. And pretty much would have made it almost impossible to have any business operate in the areas that staff deemed most appropriate for these types of uses. So, and you see the same thing kind of over here, here. And so it became our determination as a staff that it made more sense to get rid of that 600-foot requirement from residential and have them evaluate it on a case-by-case basis, letting each kind of project stand on its own, and whether or not it can win over its neighbors and the folks in the community.
Could it be the other way around? Could there be the $600, the
6,000.
the 600-foot restriction, and then when they come in to do their conditional use, then they can make their plea that, that it would make it a right fit and for us to consider it being near the residential?
So we thought that it would be expose us to more legal challenges and maybe more arbitrariness if we set a requirement and then we set parameters for basically allowing a variance. And so we thought it was just cleaner just to evaluate the site on its own merits. This is, you come in, if you win the community over, then the planning commission presumably would potentially support your project, and if you couldn't, then we don't have to make all these findings as to why there's exceptions to these rules and things of that nature. And then run the risk that somebody would file a lawsuit against the city that we were acting arbitrary in those findings and things of that nature. So at the end of the day, keep it clean, keep it straight. You either have the community support or you don't in terms of bringing it a project and getting your guys' blessing. And ultimately, if it's a build up to the council.
Because regardless, they all have to come to CUP anyways.
Correct. So that's why that. So hopefully, I've had the, so I appreciate you allowing me to have this time. Hopefully this answers, hopefully we've gotten close to a permanent answer on that, not just a part-time answer. But, and hopefully that answers your question, Commissioner Diaz, in terms of kind of why we did this.
I have a follow-up for Commissioner Diaz's question. The thing that bothers me about eliminating basically setbacks in totality is with that, by having those, I think it helped us with more uniformity. What you don't have is the setback, identified right in front.
Yep.
I'm afraid if you do everyone on a case-by-case basis, it would be the CUP, that we won't have the uniform, because each one will be different, and we could have a concentration in one area and not another, which I don't think would be good. At least it gives us a basis to start the discussion on what that uniform setback.
So I understand the thought process. I would actually argue it would be the opposite. In other words, based off of how your land use is formed right now, it's very unlikely that you wouldn't have to make the findings for essentially a deviation from your standards on every single one of them, which then makes it potentially arbitrary when you don't grant those same findings to somebody else. And if somebody deems it to be arbitrary, then they potentially file lawsuits against the city. And so that's how staff got to the recommendation of, rather than just having us have to knowing up front that we're likely to have to make, findings for deviations every single time for all four, let's just say it's an even playing field up front and prove it. Prove that you can get the community support for your location. That was the thought process.
Or is it something that, as a city, as a council, you just, similar to what was brought up about Riverbank and Oakdale not wanting it in their downtown district? And if that's what, sounds like you're kind of coming to that adoption of not wanting it downtown, well then, where do you want it? And so that helps you in making sure that you put those restrictions in place. Do you want them within 600 feet of residential? If you do, and it's a case by case, then that sounds like the argument that you don't have it in the ordinance.
So, are there any questions from the commissioners? And after that, then I'll see if there's any questions from the council, and then we would need to, Mayor, open it up to public comment.
Any questions?
I appreciate the fact that there's some flexibility in the language, that everything that is opened and built comes to commission, and that gives a community an opportunity to speak and gives us an opportunity to say, yes, this is a good location, no, this is not a good location. I think it's really important, especially in the initial years of this program. We may find that we're rubber stamping things and we could change things down the road and make it more of a staff level approval. But at this point, I appreciate the fact that we're going to get to see all of these.
Yep.
And talk to people.
And if I could clarify, let me just go over how many times you're going to see them, because I think that's an important point. You're going to get, the planning commission will see the development agreement first. The development agreement will then need to go to 2 hearings in front of the city council because it's an ordinance. You will then see a conditional use permit, planning commission. And if it's appealed, it goes in front of the city council. So that means that each project, each location, each application will be evaluated somewhere between 4 and 5 times at a minimum.
You had mentioned earlier that you were going to talk through the timeline a little bit, and can you go into a little bit more detail on that? Because it does seem, while you've said it seems that Turlock is behind the curve, I don't necessarily see it that way, so I'm curious as to, it seems like we're trying to fast track what's happening, and I'd like a little bit more.
I don't know that we're fast tracking what's happening. I think that, in part because there's only so many decisions that connect, there's only so many things to actually be decided, right? I mean, at the end of the day, the question is, do you want to allow, the question before the commission, I should say, is not whether or not to allow it. The only question is where to allow it. We are putting cultivation, manufacturing, and distribution in probably the least impactful areas, most hidden areas. And I don't see us ever recommending that those go into commercial or residential areas. So that takes them off the table. So we've thereby eliminated that discussion. I think then the discussion becomes just the retail-facing component. And the retail-facing component, it really comes down to a question of whether or not you're going to allow it in the downtown area, or you're going to restrict it outside of that area. Again, the sensitive use requirements, part of the program, pilot program, that's a council decision, not in front of the commission. So it really just comes down to whether or not you're going to allow it in the commercial, and whether or not you're going to allow it industrial, or whether, downtown, or whether or not you want to stick it all out in the industrial, light industrial areas of other communities have done, or some other communities have done. And I think that when you get down to it, and that's really the only distinction to be made, it's not probably one of those things that requires like 6 months of workshops and things of that nature to be able to make that distinction. And we also have the benefit of knowing and experiencing what others in the surrounding area have done, and kind of figuring out instinctually whether or not that works, to figure out whether or not that works for you. And I do think there needs to be at the end of the day, there does need to be a consciousness that even at a conservative element, every month that we lose probably cuts $166,000 worth of revenue out of the city. Again, that shouldn't be the driving force, but it also shouldn't be ignored.
And I guess, and you're right, because we've had workshops for accessory structures, we've had it for signs, we've had it for these kind of type of things that, maybe when you were on the commission, you got to go through all these food vendors, RV parking, right? We bring it to the community, want to know what, where does this fit? And so it is this is very much fast track compared to those things, but I guess, you keep referencing to the other communities, and that as staff, you've already gathered that information from them, and that's what's formulating what you're giving to us. And so I guess I just haven't seen examples of other communities that's been presented here, and I don't know, I think that's of value. I don't know if the commissioners feel the same way, but I think sometimes it's good to see, especially since we're a year behind other people. They have a year to have done things. Let's see what they've done. Trust that you've done your due diligence, and that's why you're presenting the way you're presenting, but I guess that's why we're here, is to kind of compare that and see, does it fit into Turlock in those zones? And again, that's what we're just looking at is, where I know that here on your it says that we're because I thought that staff had talked about they weren't too about heavy commercial, having retail in the heavy commercial, light industrial because of parking. So, how do we come to the conclusion that that is a good thing or not a good thing?
How do we come to that conclusion? So, it came down to, the parking and the types of uses, the amount of potentially pedestrian traffic, as well as other traffic that you would have going in areas where you have semis. So I think part of it's just using a little bit of common sense in terms of where we think we want people walking, and having kind of more what we would consider residential traffic going into. So I think, and your industrial areas are, particularly when you go on the WISP and the TRIP, those are fairly large concentrations as opposed to like just little outliers and things of that nature. So, whereas for instance, as in Patterson, and Amazon's right on Sperry and things of that nature, and so it's a little bit different. You can go one block in, and the road's designed for it, and it's not as big of a deal. So I think it's just based off of, staff's knowledge about, Turlock in terms of community development and police, in terms of where, if we're going to have this, where we think it best works and it best suits. It is my understanding that the vice mayor had a marijuana committee for some time.
The ad hoc committee was set up in May of 18.
Right.
Essentially, I've been in the ad hoc committee for about 14 months. Up until November, there was 2 of us, and from November to now, it's been 1 of us. Got a little more difficult.
So it's just based off of, again, our experience and kind of what we would bring to you on any project, whether this project happens to be cannabis-based, but if this was a development project, we would go through the same analysis and forming a staff recommendation to you as a commission. Just because it's cannabis doesn't make it any different from our perspective and a land use perspective.
So it is the recommendation then to be in heavy commercial, light industrial?
Yeah, the recommendations that we went over here, which I'll go back to. That's staff's recommendation.
The heavy commercial zoning district, we looked at other similar uses, so retail sales is a permitted use in the heavy commercial zoning district. So that's what we correlated sales to. So that is currently in the proposal that retail would be allowed in heavy commercial.
Because I'm sorry, Doug, I thought on Thursday, because that was the first time we got
Yeah.
introduced to this. It's just been a few days, but
Yeah.
I thought you had mentioned that there would be no retail in those areas, so that's why I just, and.
Well, the light industrial and heavy commercial you can go into, but not the heavy industrial.
Okay.
I'm sorry, maybe I may have misspoke during that time too.
So heavy
Sometimes I talk too
industrial-
fast.
We're fast tracking, so we gotta make sure.
So heavy industrial is not part of it.
Not for retail.
Heavy commercial, light industrial.
Yeah.
For retail.
Yeah.
And often when staff refers to it, we just call it heavy commercial, so that might be where some of the, in the zoning ordinance, it has the whole name of heavy commercial, light industrial, but when we present projects to you, we call it the heavy commercial zoning district.
Okay.
Some of it's not I even get, it's not intuitive, so.
So to clarify, staff is recommending mostly heavy commercial, light industrial being the best locations for all four, or for some?
For some, I think that while we allow it heavy commercial, light industrial for retail use, the real emphasis is on the community commercial. That's right, right?
Yes.
The one on Golden State?
Retail would be with the community commercial, heavy commercial, and then the three zoning designations that are within the downtown. So that would be downtown core transition, and transitional commercial. And those are, in the downtown, they have an underlying use that relates back to community commercial. So again, that's how that relationship is made. So those are the retail right now, the proposed areas. There would be no retail under what is proposed in this ordinance allowed within the West Side Industrial Specific Plan area at all. And so that's in the smaller overlay and within the larger West Side Industrial Specific Plan master plan area.
Actually, the other one's
I'm
better.
not hearing you, and I'm not hearing everything exactly. So there'd be no retail in the downtown area, is that correct? What did you say?
No, there would be. I'm putting up the,
There would be no retail in the WISP.
in the WISP. But if you look right here, where there's stars is where it would be allowed, in the downtown area.
So it's allowed downtown.
Allowed in downtown. Retail, retail.
Only retail.
But I can tell you right now, so for instance, in downtown, you have buildings that maybe have a residential unit above it. We would require that they control both units. You wouldn't be able to have like
Somebody
an
live-
apartment on top of dispensary.
So if retail sales would be permitted in community commercial, why is the downtown area being called out specifically?
Because it's not allowed in every, like in the green, it's not allowed. in the
So
green
it's
part.
just identifying within that area where it would be allowed?
Correct. We're being
Any
more
other
specific.
Community commercial throughout the city would be okay?
Yes. Now, remember, I want to make one distinction. Tonight, you aren't approving anything. You're approving a zoning code, hopefully, but you're not approving any specific person or applicant to operate. They would still have to go through a development agreement. They still have to do a conditional use permit process. This is just telling us they can't even fill out an application unless the use that they are submitting the application for is allowed in one of these zones. So in the downtown, we're being even more specific about where it can be allowed, and it's not every place. Like, for instance, you can't do it in the yellow, and you can't do it in the green. So when I mention those 4 or 5 steps, this isn't one of them.
Right.
And then basically every one of those steps along the way, we can look at traffic patterns and safely entering and exiting the site. Because I know if you go to some of the county islands out there where they do have dispensaries going that actually have high volume.
Yep.
It's, it's just the Wild West out there trying to just drive by, not hitting somebody back and kind of whatnot.
Yep.
Right.
And I would to council, I mean to Commissioner, I almost promoted you, to Commissioner Diaz's point, if this commission would like, following tonight, I'd be happy to work with the Community Development Department and set up a tour, an agendized tour to tour some of the dispensaries and other facilities in the neighboring communities so that you can actually go and see them for yourself.
Are you providing baked lays also?
I am not providing big things. I appreciate it.
Just asking.
Because I do think that, I think it's important when you start to evaluate sites that you have some points of reference.
Right, yeah, I think we should probably look at that, just so as a commission, we have an idea of the operation, how it actually works, so that when we're looking at these cups, we can take that into consideration, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
That fit within our timeline that you're presenting.
Can you do it tomorrow?
I think that if we can get the zoning code, then I think absolutely before we bring any applicants before you, that we can get it done. So I would assume that that would be done before when's our next meeting?
Our next regular meeting is next Thursday.
That's not this meeting, it'd be the meeting after that. So so it would probably, between now and then, yeah.
I think that's important
Yeah,
for us
I do
to
too.
see that, because it's a new industry that most people are not, obviously, privy to, you know,
Yeah.
understand.
And I think it's good that you guys go as a group, and any community members who want to go can go too, because it'll be a public meeting. In terms of looking at the different ones, and luckily, we don't have to go very far, so.
So what do we need to do to make that happen?
Just say you'd like it to happen, and we'll make it
Okay,
happen.
let's make that happen.
Okay.
Look at that.
Done.
Chair Powers has spoken.
Okay, thank you.
I have a couple questions just to,
Mhm.
so basically, what you're saying is that downtown is because there's no other place to go. There's a green area, you can't go there, you can't go the yellow area, so that drives stuff downtown.
I think the reason that we specifically called out and had a long discussion among staff about how to deal with the downtown because of my past experiences with other communities and the pros and cons that we discussed here. And it was our decision as a staff that if we're going to allow it, and we're only going to allow 4, that it made sense to at least allow people to apply there. Again, I want to make a really important distinction here. Just because somebody is allowed to apply, that that you're allowed to submit a location there, does not mean that this body or this council is going to approve that location. So we just said it should be something that somebody should be able to apply for, and we'll evaluate that site. Candidly, I don't know what the reaction of the Downtown Business Association is going to be. I don't know what the reaction of the downtown folks is going to be. It may be positive, it may be negative. The other component to it is there's no guarantee that we're going to get anybody who even applies, who makes it through this process, that even has a location out here. Most of them are in Golden State that we've seen in the RFQs.
But regardless, the Downtown Association, all of them will have a chance to come to the CUP.
Correct.
To plead their case for or against.
4 or 5 times.
Yeah.
So basically, you're saying you've had a year's worth of experience in the surrounding areas.
Yeah, more than a year, but yeah.
And we're getting a lot of credence to that.
Yes.
Even though they are in a state of flux right now, too, they're changing the rules as we talk. Just mentioned a minute ago, they're actually loosening them up, actually.
Riverbank.
Oh, loosening them up, yeah, I mean, they're not tightening them up yet.
Some of them may have tightened too as well, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that's it. I'm concerned because I don't think a year is a long time. I mean, this is something entirely new. The whole campus issue is something that's a lot of people finding surprise,
Yeah.
actually. But I want to be cautious. I think we should take a cautious approach to what we're doing. It's a lot easier to do something right the first time than to undo it later. I'm also concerned about unintended consequences, which often happens in community projects. So, and I'm also concerned about the integrity of our downtown. That's the face of our city, is our downtown. And how people react to having cannabis retailers right downtown. So I'm at this particular point, I want to take a very cautious approach. And make sure we know what we're going to try to get right the first time, although I know we won't, but we'll get as close as we can.
That's fine. I mean, I think the biggest thing for everybody to notice is cannabis is being delivered next door to schools currently in Turlock from delivery services that I can't control or do anything about. That's why I have my litigation against the State Bureau of Cannabis Control. Can do nothing about it. what we're trying to do is create a regulated environment where we actually know who's operating here, as opposed to an unregulated environment that's completely out of my control, that's like sand in my hand. So cannabis exists in Turlock. Nothing that we're going to do here changes that, except for whether or not there's going to be identified access that's regulated by the city. So,
I don't think we're far apart. We may have had our opinions on cannabis private. That pays up the station, it's legal, it's here.
Yep.
I'm just concerned about moving too quickly, make sure we do it correctly. And I also have a real concern, some of you mentioned other cities haven't you,
Yeah.
the place that are downtown.
Yeah.
To our visitors. And I'm concerned about that as well. So I just want to make that point.
no, that's what we're looking for tonight. I mean, I think whether or not you want retail to allow it in the downtown is an important discussion point. Whether or not you want to allow it in basically along Golden State and some of the commercial area as opposed to just sticking it out in the industrial area, I think that's an important discussion point for tonight. It is staff's recommendation that you allow it in the downtown in the places that's identified and as well as in the commercial along Golden State. But we're staff. You guys got appointed for a reason. So that's your call.
So I'll say to that, right, so my position would be, is that it has to come to CUP so that we can actually hear what the community wants. Because we don't know, they could be all for it down there. But until we get if we go down the path of saying remove it, we'll never get an application to know if it is a pro for the community, that they actually want to see it there or not. If it's there, it comes to CUP, and then we can decide what the mood of the town is at that point, and take, base our recommendation off of that. So, you know what I mean? Like, at this early stage, leaving it in gives us the opportunity to actually see if somebody applies there, and then see what the community reaction to that is. If we try and take it out now, we'll never know.
I think we're going to know. We're going to have community respond.
So any more discussion amongst the commission? If not, I'd probably ask that the council go back to council.
Vice Mayor?
Yes. A couple of comments to address them. First of all, yeah, I don't feel that we're rushing this because, like I said, we started working on it 14 months ago. I visited at least a half dozen dispensaries, cultivation, manufacturing. The state is almost pushing us to do things because they're trying to control what the city can and can't do. That's one of the reasons Turlock joined this lawsuit against that. The League of Cities is pushing to fight the state regulation on just letting anybody distribute wherever they want, whether we like it or not. I believe that, as it was mentioned, the cannabis is around us anyway. If you haven't, and I'm really happy to see that you are going to visit some of these, because that was the deciding factor for me. I visited several of these, completely different from what I expected. They're professional businesses. When you drive up, you don't even know what you're driving, the type of businesses that is in that building. You won't know. There's no signage out there that tells you it's a cannabis business. So when you visit some of these things, I think you'll be surprised, and they're professionally run. The thing about the pilot program is I want the pilot program to succeed. I don't want to waste my time on something that we're going to kill before it even gets started. So we got to give it a chance, and that's why that's the reason I changed my mind to support this. So all the safeguards are going to be in place. Will there be problems? Maybe. We can't anticipate everything, but what we've seen with the other cities up to this point that are allowing it, minimal. They have many more problems with the local bars that they do with any of the cannabis businesses. So if that's an issue, don't even think about that, because it's just non-existent. That's, yeah, essentially I've done a lot of research. I did a lot of visiting, so I urge anybody and everybody that hasn't visited one of these businesses, or two of them, go check them out. You will be surprised at what you're gonna see. And like I said, you're gonna drive up to, and you won't even know it's a cannabis business when you drive up.
Councilmember Nazari?
So I had a question about the interview to approval process. So right now we have 32 interviews that are going to be, that we're going to be going, staff is going to be going through.
Yep.
And at that point, we'll have 4, I think I'm getting a little feedback, 4 applicants that will be deemed the highest ranking from that. Is that correct?
Yeah, best fit for the community.
Best fit, okay. Would it be possible for us to, because when it comes down to the 4 that I'm gonna be seeing, I think it would enable me to make a better decision knowing what's in the pipeline of the 4 behind, as opposed to just saying, these are the top 4 that staff has decided, because I think that if they're qualified, with a pool of 32, if they're qualified and they're amongst the top qualified, it helps me as a council member say, okay, maybe I don't like number 3 because it has this, and number 5 or 6 really fits my specific kind of desires within the applicant process. So I would vote no, knowing what's available down below.
So, it's our intention to give you 3 groups, okay? The first group would be 10, the second group would be 11, and the third group would be 11, so that people roughly know where they're at. It is, at this point in time, our preference to not say who's in 5th, 6th place. We would let people know that they're in the top 10, right? But the rationale being is, I don't want artificial efforts being done to subvert the people who come in the top 4 with the idea, oh, I just got to knock 2 out, and if I knock 2 out, then I'm in. And then you have potentially artificial community input that's all predicated on moving somebody up. So it's our intention at this point in time, unless council directs me otherwise, to give you the top 4 and give you the top 10, but 5 through 10 wouldn't be in any particular, it will be given to you in alphabetical.
Yeah, as long as I have a group of,
Yeah.
these are the ones that we thought were highly qualified.
Yeah, each of the groups are going to be in alphabetical order with the.
Okay, okay, great. And then on the conversation of the downtown area, I think for planning consideration, the key consideration is going to be how it's going to be impacting the traffic and the surrounding areas and things like that. And I foresee a situation where, we've done some parking studies in the downtown area with the projection of needing additional parking in a 10-year timeline or so. So can we make something where, if we have an applicant in the downtown core, it would be accepted based on giving us basically the money up front to be able to expand our parking capacity in the core, make the development agreements something like, instead of receiving it on a monthly basis, we get all that money up front to build a parking structure that this addition to the downtown core would likely need? Or is that going to be discussed at that point, or should we build it into the process right away?
So, when we negotiate the development agreements and then the conditions that follow them, we will make sure that any of the applicants completely mitigate their impact.
Okay.
And that's, potentially societal as well. Those are items that can be negotiated. We have to be a little bit careful because you can't make it so onerous that, for instance, if we built a parking structure, you're talking about potentially somewhere between $3 and $10 million. And that probably means that they ain't coming downtown. Yeah. So it's that kind of, but a contribution towards it, absolutely, yeah.
The other thing, you said that we didn't have any applicants on the testing side, and I think that's a really big piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
I have 2 questions here. The deadline has passed for applicants, is there a reason that we have cut off receiving applicants for these industries or these licenses in which we have an unlimited allowance?
Yes. So, I mean, the biggest thing is so that we can create a group that's static that we can just process first. And, I mean, candidly, when I went into this process, I think when I was before council, I was expecting 8 to 14. Not in my wildest dreams did I expect 40. And so at this point in time, I'm really, really happy that we have that deadline. That being said, if somebody wanted to submit an RFQ response for testing or something else, we would absolutely accept it. They would not be processed, though, until we process all of the other folks, which means as it stands right now, that you would have 8 non-retail folks that we'll be processing and 4 retail folks, so for a total of 12 applicants that we have to go through first. And if some of those applicants get booted or don't work out, then we would be replacing those, and then we would take the second group. And the second group, there's no real limitation on. And the second group does not include, just so we're not accepting more RFQ responses for retail dispensaries, because I hope that out of 32, we can find 4.
I mean, on the testing side, I know that we had one of the local businesses that expressed it. Did you hear anything from them? No.
I expected to get a response, and when I heard that there was 40 responses, I assumed it was one of them, and it wasn't.
So the product that would be coming through on the retail side, they have testing requirements before
Yes.
sale? Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Councilmember Leffers?
With the testing, it kind of piggybacks on Andrew's question. Where would a retail dispensary, would they be testing out of the area? Would it be more, is that a factor that they, as business owners, they need to consider when they're coming into a place where they're going to be testing, or?
I'm sure they consider it, but I think that retail is probably the most sought after application, why we have 32 of the 40 people are seeking retail, because it doesn't matter if you grow it, manufacture it, if you don't have a place to sell it.
Okay.
You know, that's kind of the key to the kingdom, so to speak.
Okay.
So that's why I think we have 32 for retail side.
And just to clarify my understanding, the reason why we are talking specifically kind of about the downtown overlay is because there's lots of different zoning that's kind of included in that area, correct? It's not commercial, it's not community commercial. It's downtown, it's specifically zoned, and that's why we have to kind of focus on it. We're not focusing on it because we're all, hey, let's put it there. It's just because it's a different entity when it's being zoned, we have to kind of include it in this conversation, correct?
You're correct, but I actually think it's just the opposite. I think we're being hypersensitive to the fact it's downtown.
Right.
And I mean, we had a very detailed discussion to recognize the importance of downtown, and this is why it was the way staff's recommend. I mean, well, there was a lot of discussion about this. This wasn't some kind of trivial recommendation.
Great. And within those 4 or 5 times that between these two groups we would see these applicants, how many of those are public meetings? Are all of them?
All of them.
Okay. And I just wanted to point out one quick piece. I know that our ordinance that we approved in June, beginning of June, and one thing we really talked about, which we actually put into the ordinance, I'm not sure if it's different than other communities, is actually requiring a state licensed security officer at every single dispensary or retail that would be applying here. And I'm not sure if you could speak to how it's obviously a heightened parameter, I would think.
It is. So most folks don't put it. This was the discussion that we've had before. It's not something that most folks put into the actual ordinance itself. If it shows up, it shows up in either their security plans or in the conditional use permit conditions. So you guys got elevated in importance and actually put it in your code. And I will say that there are lots of experiences in both cities that we represent and cities we don't, where those security forces have served a larger benefit to the community in terms of both cleaning it up and eliminating peripheral issues and overall just creating additional safety.
Perfect. Thank you.
Just wanted to make a couple comments. You know, it's possible we won't even see anybody go downtown because one of the prime factors they look for is parking. Most of the dispensaries that I did visit, one of the key factors that they all said is they look for someplace where they have sufficient parking. So we may or may not even see any going downtown. Aside from that, just wanted to address the security question. Security is very, very well kept at all of them. Not just the security, armed security guards. They have camera systems that you could actually recognize a person when you see it. One of the, I believe it was the one in Riverbank, they had one instance where there was a bank robbery across the street. And the sheriff actually used the dispensary's cameras to get a better recognition of the people that were robbing the bank than the bank's cameras. So they are all state-of-the-art, top quality. I told you, it was very, very impressive.
Okay, let's open it to the public. Anyone wishing to speak, come on up to the lectern over here.
And Mayor, if I could, I would ask council, because we only have a half an hour before we're technically over and we're hoping to get some action, that we do just limit it to 3 minutes per person.
Understood. 3 minutes. Come on up, Mr. Young Puffer. Right?
Michael Puffer, 3040 Augsburg Court, District 4. So, just throwing my own opinion on the downtown having dispensary there. I don't think any sort of integrity is being threatened if there was a dispensary there. Because the couple of dispensaries I was there, I ever saw in my life, I mean, no offense to them, they were generic. It was almost like going through one of the vintage fair malls, jewelry counters. And when downtown Turlock has 2 nightclubs and a hookah business over there, and I don't mean anything against them, by all means, I think there should be a growing nightlife at downtown. I just feel like that a generic, boring cannabis dispensary isn't really threatening any sort of integrity that downtown has. So just throwing my own opinion over there.
Anyone else? Mr. Warda.
Hello, Mayor, members of the council, commissioners. I've done a few of these now, and what I can tell you is that nobody really shows up from the public to oppose the idea of registering or regulating the businesses. They will show up for your commission hearing when it's time to put it in a specific location with concerns. And so you'll have the opportunity to look at that. I think what the chairman said was exactly right on point, which is give yourself all the options you can, approve what staff has recommended here, because it gives you an opportunity to see what's before you and opens up locations. I mean, you've been given discretion to look at whether something's a good idea or not, based on parking, based on what the neighborhood says. In some places, the neighbors won't mind, and in some places they'll come and they'll say, well, this is why we don't like it. And because it's new, a lot of them raise the same issues, which is they're afraid of crime or they're afraid of certain things that they associate with cannabis, which doesn't ever materialize. The dispensaries that I work with in Stanislaus County, collectively probably see 2,000 people a day now, and they haven't had a call for service. So they operate very well. They're very well regulated. They are very concerned about keeping their license because they've got a very big investment in their business. And so I encourage you to go with what staff is recommending here, because you will get to see this at a very close, detailed level throughout this process. And I'm sure that there are tons of people that will open their doors for tours if you guys want to take a look at dispensaries, cultivation. There's a lot of good operators in the county already that are licensed, that are operating. Some of them are here in the room, and so that shouldn't be a problem for you. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Franzen?
Yeah, I wanted to speak to the fast tracking comments. I've actually been to a lot of discussions about this, and even more so, it's been going online quite a while. I'm actually Well, I was hoping it would go through quicker than this, actually, because a lot of the same points are being discussed over and over. And a lot of the comments, like about the impacts, have already been addressed by other cities, like Ceres. I mean, if you want to talk about fast track, that'd be really fast tracked to see that they went through the process and have been existing for over a year now. So their process started, it wasn't just a year that they started it. So they probably were discussing it for a couple years. Our former mayor wouldn't even agendize it, and it was something that was obviously going to be addressed. It should have at least been called forward. Also, regarding the planning, I mean, I see, and I don't know the answer, I'd like to sort of get it, but how many how many vehicles we're talking about? I just heard a couple thousand, but I don't know what exactly that entails. But how many cars are we expecting? Maybe the city attorney might have some examples. I did go to a Downtown Property Owners Association board meeting where a person was interested in a location downtown. And I believe most of the concerns I heard was over parking. And I think everyone was against that pretty much in an informal sense. It was just an informational heads up that they were looking at it. But the parking is a big deal, and also the traffic to other areas. So even if there's a commercial zoning, but there's residential around, how many car trips are we talking about? I think that would be important to have it. I heard Golden State was mentioned. That sounds like a good type location, or maybe somewhere off the freeway, I don't know. And also fast tracking too, just a little side thing. The ban on Super Walmart, that was like 15 years ago. I mean, if Planning Commission could ever take that up, Super Walmart's, come and gone, and now there's Amazon, so people aren't even just taking from small business, they're skipping over even Walmart. But anyways, I appreciate the council and the commission actually hearing this and moving it forward. And I'd like to get the answers on the parking and the traffic as it concerns to planning specifically. Thanks.
Anybody else? Okay, if not, I will close the public hearing. Mr. White, do you have some comments? Or answers, or?
Can I ask, Mike, do you know about the parking?
You get 3 minutes.
Do you know about the traffic count per? Yeah.
Oh, phone a friend?
Yeah, I phoned a friend.
Yeah, so most of the traffic occurs after 4 till about, whenever they close in the evenings. They do generate a lot of traffic, and so you need, 25, 30, sometimes 40 parking spaces, depending on, how big the business is, how good of operator they are. You can look at their existing records for most of them, and you can determine. But parking is always a concern, and you want to make sure you have it. So, but I would say 30 to 40 spaces for.
Thanks. Hopefully I answered that question.
Okay. Any last comments from commission? Yes.
I have a question. What are typical hours of operation?
See, most of what I've seen has been in the 9 to 9 range. I've seen some go to 10, but I would say that typically it's in the 9 to 9 range. I've also seen it go as late as 11 to 9, but that could be part of your conditions.
So that would be something that we could.
Yes, and it could be different depending on the location. Like, so for instance, one location might be more suitable for a morning operation and another one might not be.
Thank you.
As well as we'll be addressing the parking on a per basis in the
Yeah.
hub.
Well, I can guarantee that the city engineer will have lots of important thoughts on how many spaces would be required.
Right,
So.
because as part of their business plan, right, they're gonna
Yes.
have to let us know what their anticipated generation of customers is.
Yeah.
Does the pilot program also include hemp manufacturing?
It does at the moment, because we have not differentiated at the local level between industrial hemp and regular hemp. So there is going to be one industrial hemp application who's not very happy about it, that will go through the process, because otherwise he'd have to wait until probably early next year, really, really late this year, for us to do that. I have promised him that once he goes through this process, I'd bring something before council, determine whether or not they want to reverse his RFQ funds. And this is something that's just become an issue basically in every city in Stanislaus County that we represent. Not Newman, but everything but Newman. So, so it's an issue that we're dealing with, but the current status of our code doesn't differentiate.
has a difference. So the 4 and they'd be in that.
It has THC in it.
Right.
It's cannabis for our purposes at the moment.
Okay. Any other questions?
Council.
CBD isn't regulated, is it?
It is.
It is?
Yeah.
Would this also fall into this application process, just CBD?
Yes. I mean, there's a level of it really goes down to the level of THC as to whether or not, to what level we regulate it. I mean, you'll see, I'm going to tease Stacy for a second, but there's, hand lotions and stuff like that you can buy
On your desk.
in grocery stores right now that that say hemp and stuff like that, and maybe have a cannabis flower, but they don't have any THC in them, and so, and it's just a product that's available at a grocery store or at a
Yeah, so the
convenience store.
stuff that is entirely CBD just goes through
Yeah.
outside of this.
It's a different process. So industrial hemp, we just don't differentiate yet. So.
Yes, I was just gonna say, yeah, because you can find CBD oils at Bed Bath & Beyond and every place else, so. The one comment I would make, nobody really brought up, and I wasn't sure if there was any, I just want to clarify. When the customers come up to a dispensary, there is no smoking or any use on-site, there's no on-site usage. They pick up and they leave. The security won't even let them sit in the parking lot. They just, you pick up your product and you leave. So I just want to make sure we clarified that also, just in case there's any questions out there about that.
And I'm just going to make a statement real quick, because my colleagues know how I feel about this, but many of you may not. So just as a point of reference, I believe it's unconstitutional. You cannot supersede state superseding federal, and we all took an oath to uphold each of those. And so I'm going to be a no throughout the whole process without a lot of dialogue. I'll have input, when we talk about things, but as far as I'm concerned, it's a no until we don't have to money launder. So that's just my personal belief. So you want us to each do?
So council is not agendized for action tonight.
Okay.
But given the fact that we're doing this, it would be good to not have to do it twice. So any input that you guys would like to have, I think it's important for the commission, to hear that. And then we are agendized tonight for the commission to take action, and it would be staff's recommendation that you adopt the zoning changes as proposed in the agenda.
So Chair Powers,
Okay, so I will read the staff recommendation and then ask for a motion, because nobody has it to read. So it says, the Planning Commission recommends that the City Council adopt Ordinance Amendment 2019-01, amendment to the Turlock Municipal Code related to land use and zoning regulations for commercial cannabis. Having determined that the project is exempt from CEQA pursuant to the Public Resources Code sections 21065 and 21068 and CEQA guidelines sections 15061B3 of Title 14 of the California Code of Regulations, and having made that the findings contained in the Draft Planning Commission Resolution number 2019-16. Do I have a motion?
Yes, we have a motion.
Do I have a second? Okay, all in favor? Aye.
Can we call the roll?
Yeah.
Particularly in this
I
one,
will
I'm
do
sorry.
a roll call vote.
Okay, sure.
Commissioner Souza? Commissioner Davis?
Yes.
Commissioner Anderson?
Yes.
Commissioner Reap?
Yes.
Commissioner Varani?
Yes.
Commissioner Diaz?
Yes.
Chair Powers?
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all, really appreciate it. I know that this is a difficult issue, but you have left me with the ominous task of scheduling a trip for you. So we're going to try to get that scheduled as quickly as possible. So, and then we'll get you the details. It will be, again, a publicly agendized meeting, which means those members of the public who want to go on the tour as well would be welcome.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
And lastly, the council member and commissioner questions, comments, and announcements, since we only get together once a year together. Anything with you guys?
I'll ask anyone else if anyone has anything.
I have nothing.
Well, thanks for having us for our yearly meeting.
Well, thank
And
you
we'll-
all for
we'll see you next year.
participating. Yeah, absolutely. And my colleagues?
I told her to have cookies for you, she didn't.
Ow.
I guess I do have one thing, maybe I'll comment on just this specific situation, for maybe things that come up in the future. So it sounds like, council has been working on this for over a year, right? And
7 months, really,
Okay.
the new ones.
Okay, so, and from a commission aspect, I think you get a lot of this, we're fast tracking it because we were given information Thursday.
Right.
Right, so maybe if we could be brought into the general discussions earlier.
Sure.
So we're a little more well-versed when it comes time to the nuts and bolts, you know what I mean? Then we won't have the feeling of, we're trying to slide something through in 3 days. You know what I mean?
I appreciate that. It did go on in dialogue under the other regime,
Okay,
just an ad hoc, and so even though I am absolutely against it, I
Yeah.
put it on the agenda, and I'll take blame that we should have probably identified this with you guys because it was going to get to you.
Right.
So
Yeah, I mean-
anything else that's coming up like that, I'll make sure that we throw it
Yeah.
out there and make sure you guys are aware it's coming.
right, and then we can, choose to participate or not
Right.
in that portion, but, just to give a little more background and detail and what's going on, so.
If I could, Mayor, so as you guys have known, I think I've been here maybe 3.5 months.
Seems
So
like a year.
It seems like forever, I know. Seems like just yesterday. But it'd be part of my commitment. I think that this is one of the things because we were dealing with an interim situation that kind of falls through the cracks, but it's my commitment that will keep you guys in the loop. I've had an amazing time working with the Community Development Department, Katie and Nathan, and so it's my personal pledge to make sure that, that this doesn't, you don't get surprised, so.
I absolutely appreciate that.
Anything, comments?
And I will use all the assistance I can get, so if you guys want some work to do, I will be glad to let you in.
Councilman Larson?
Just thank you for your service and for your commitment. And the dialogue, I think, was really fruitful and really productive. So I really appreciate the diving into an issue, even if it was late notice. I understand that we do need to probably involve commissioners when issues come up at a sooner pace. But thank you for your commitment to serving our community.
And when you speak last, you end up saying ditto. So thank you guys so much for your service. I do want you all to know that I am available to if you guys ever have concerns. You're also one of the front lines for interfacing with our public about whatever issues they may have with our city from the planning side. So let's try and work together as much as possible. I'd love to meet with each and every one of you individually at some point.
I just wanted to tell the council, don't forget about the planning department. Because this is developing things, and so making sure that they're staffed accordingly to the things that are asked of them. And we're really, I think as a whole, we're really happy that we have now a director, which was, she was doing the job. So I think that was a good move on the council. So, but just remember that you're, and I think we're all appreciative of the staff, the hard work that they do, and so we don't want to leave them hanging, especially when we're asking so much of them. So.
Okay, then if you would adjourn?
May I have a motion for adjournment?
Yes.
You all ready for it?
Move to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor, say? Aye. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.